Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at the event that is kind of the event when it comes to the United States becoming an imperial power and truly emerging from it, not only having overseas territories, but really being kind of considered by other major powers of the world as, one of the big contenders and one of the forces to be reckoned with and one of the nations to be included in certain considerations and discussions and those kind of things. So imperialism, those attitudes and tendencies and the push for imperialism and that the United States needed to acquire overseas territories and should and had a right to, and all of the economic reasons for it, which economics just really was one of the, and probably was the main reason why American imperialism became what it became. All those things, of course, have been building for a while. Some people might even argue going way back further than what we talked about. And all of those same things lead to this conflict with Spain, a very short conflict with Spain in the summer, basically just the summer of 1898, that we call the Spanish-American War. And this is, in the grand scheme of things, if you look at American wars, given, what your criteria is, but some people might consider this one of the most successful wars the United States was ever involved in, as far as it's one of the shortest with the least amount of casualties and the largest amount of gain. The United States will gain significant overseas territories for the United States as a result of this conflict with Spain, which, keeping in mind, at this point, Spain, this is not the same Spain that we learned about at the beginning of 10th grade that was the most powerful nation with this huge, vast, wealthy empire. By this point, by the late 19th century, that had very much declined. And Spain was, they're not falling apart. It's not like they're, just hanging on by a thread, but their glory days of imperial power are definitely waning and had been for quite some time by the time this rolls around. The United States is well aware of that and probably chooses their enemy quite carefully in this particular conflict. But nevertheless, let's start with the causes of the war. Of course, imperialism and the desire for expansion, all of that we need to remember is an underlying theme through all of this. And this is also one of those things, like a lot of wars, I don't think, you could say similar things about nearly any war the United States has been involved in, but we should consider, there are those things that, when the United States goes to war, that are kind of part of the official dialogue, the official narrative of this is what we're fighting for, this is why we have declared war, this is why we're involved in it. But then there's also all that subtext about what is it really about, or what are some additional things that it's about. And that's where you can argue, all day long, because some people might say, no, that's not true, or whatever, or maybe it was a part of it, but not so much. So this is where there were interesting and heated debates going on in 1898 about that, about what was this really about, and you can still have those debates even now, and people still do have those debates even now about what exactly was this about and what were the true motives for the United States being involved in this conflict. But nevertheless, let's take a look at some of these overall causes. Remember that Spain at this point has greatly declined as far as having colonies and imperial power. We know that at one point they controlled huge parts of this hemisphere, huge parts of North America, most of Central America, most of South America. But by the time we get to 1898, when this war is fought, Spain is left with very, very little colonial holdings in the Western Hemisphere. Most of those had declared independence long before all of this. The one that they were kind of clinging on to, that was still a Spanish possession, that was in the balance here, was Cuba, which of course is just 90 miles to the south of Florida. But Cuba was a Spanish colony still at this point, but it was in a state of constant rebellion. And Cubans in there were constantly rebelling against Spanish rule, resisting Spanish rule, trying to become independent. government, and Spain was desperately trying to suppress such rebellion and hang on to Cuba. And that trouble led to, one, a lot of instability in Cuba and a lot of destruction and death and economic damage and all kind of things, which was upsetting to the United States, partially for economic reasons, because the United States definitely has a lot of economic interest in Latin America. You have American investors in, that have owned properties. Sugar crops and things like that in Cuba. And so all of the instability, really threatened American interests for that reason. But it was also very troubling to a lot of Americans morally. I think we definitely should point that out, because Spain reacted eventually very, very harshly to this. And they were, rounding up Cubans. They were putting them in concentration camps, into forced labor camps. There were hundreds of Cubans dying every day because of these atrocities that were being committed by Spain, trying to suppress all of this and put down this rebellion. So a big reason for a lot of people, or a big reason that a lot of people would articulate as to why the United States would go to war with Spain, was to protect Cuba. And this becomes part of that really official narrative when the United States does declare war. That would always be kind of listed as the main reason why we have to do this, to protect Cuba, to intervene on their behalf, because they're being tortured, they are being destroyed, and a lot of the destruction was being caused by Cubans themselves. They were, intentionally destroying their sugar crops and things like that to sort of, try to push Spain out. But there were a lot of moral considerations about all that, and this was very upsetting to many Americans, and many felt they had to go to war to stop Spain from doing all those things and to help Cuba become independent and get rid of Spain. Now, those atrocities in Cuba are also being further exaggerated and certainly pushed to the front of American consciousness because of that yellow journalism. So even we talked about yellow journalism previously as being one of the things that stirs up American imperialism, but it is also one of the causes of the Spanish-American War, because it is these yellow journalists that are publishing the stories about all the stuff that's going on in Cuba, and publishing it in a sensational way that's really getting people's attention, that's designed to get people upset, that's designed to get an emotional response out of people. Yes, to sell newspapers, but also to sell a certain agenda. And again, the stuff going on in Cuba was absolutely true. There were terrible, terrible things going on, but yellow journalists were really good at exaggerating some stuff or emphasizing certain things over others, or filling in sketchy details with details of their own, to make it really sound like this was I don't want to say trying to make it sound worse than it was, but definitely make it seem even more offensive to Americans particularly, and really highlighting the threats to Americans in the way that some American citizens in Cuba were being harassed and being hurt and things like that. So the yellow journalists really trumped this up as well. And that continues throughout the war, and suggesting that the United States needed to intervene. And there it combines with those overall themes that imperialism is masculine, and this is about proving ourselves and not letting another country get away with this kind of thing and stuff like that. Yellow journalism will also plays a role in these next two things. So all of it is intertwined. A specific instance where the yellow journalists really have a big impact on public opinion, shifting public opinion against Spain and shifting public opinion in favor of, we have to intervene to help Cuba and we can't allow these atrocities to continue. And that is the printing of something called the Delone letter. This was a letter from an official, a Spanish official in America, and he wrote this letter back to the Spanish government. And in it, he was heavily criticizing President McKinley. This is all during the presidency of President William McKinley, who was elected president in 1896. And he said all these unflattering things about him. The yellow journalists get a hold of this, publish it in the papers, and of course, people take it as a really huge insult, and how dare they say these things about the president and about the United States. And so when they print that, it further whips up that anti anti-Spanish sentiment and this idea that the United States should fight for its honor, as well as defending Cuba and all of that. Another incident that is a troubling incident on its own and would have probably become a cause for war on its own, but is certainly helped along by the yellow journalism. And this is often kind of considered sort of the main reason, like this is what actually causes the United States to give a declaration of war, although all these other things are absolutely a part of it. And that is the explosion of an American battleship, the USS Maine. This is all happening. We talked last time about the Alfred Thayer Mahan and the naval power thing. The United States is just developed these, beautiful new all steel battleships, very modern looking Navy. The USS Maine was one of those new fancy battleships, and it was docked in Havana Harbor in Cuba when one night in February of 1898, it mysteriously explodes, killing 200 something plus American sailors. And when it explodes in the harbor in Cuba, people immediately blame Spain and assume that it had to do with the Spanish, that it was sabotage, that they had bombed it, that they had torpedoed it, something along those lines. You can see the newspaper here right next to me from the New York Journal. This is an example of the yellow journalism. You can see destruction of the warship Maine was a work of an enemy, automatically assuming that this had to do with Spain and that they had intentionally done this and this was an act of war. Now, they're printing all of that stuff without any proof that that was what had happened. And in fact, even evidence at the time suggested that it was not likely Spain that did anything, that it was likely the result of an accident, that it was like the result of of ammunition and different, explosive materials not being stored properly. And actually the official word after investigations decades later into all of this, it is the official conclusion now that the explosion of the USS Maine was an accident, that it was not the work of Spain or Cubans or anybody else, that they didn't store some didn't store some ammunition and explosive materials correctly, and the thing blows up. Nevertheless, this becomes probably the thing that whips people up, that whips leaders up into a frenzy that we have to declare war on Spain. And of course, the yellow journalists are all involved in that as well. So we have these ongoing atrocities in Cuba. And this desire amongst a lot of Americans to help Cuba, to save them, help them be independent and all of that, plus all of this stuff that's being exaggerated and some of the stuff that's not exactly true, that's being insinuated with the yellow journalism, and Americans feeling insulted. And then just this overall, pro-imperialism attitude that this is part of what the United States needed to do and needed to kind of take their place in the world. So all of this leads to, in April of 1898, President McKinley will go to Congress asking for a declaration of war. And in that declaration of war, he is clear to emphasize that this is about overall reaching peace eventually. This is about, which is so odd, to talk about that when you're talking about declaring war, but talking about this is about American security. This is about securing peace for Cuba. This is about helping out our friends in Cuba, and they are, we want them to be independent. They're fighting for independence, and we have to help them do that. We don't want Spain to rule over them. He is careful to say this is not about acquiring overseas territories. This is not about flexing our muscles. This is not about power. It's not about imperialism, in other words. It's not about trying to spread our influence other places. This is about helping other people and stepping up for overall peace and security. So he certainly emphasizes some things over others. And McKinley was really quite conflicted about war overall because he didn't really want to fight, didn't really want to go to a war over it the way that some Americans probably certainly did. But at the same time, he didn't think it was a good idea to leave Cuba in the hands of Spain, nor did he want Cuba to become totally independent yet. So there's a lot of conflict going on, within a lot of people's minds about what exactly to do all of this. Now, the Congress, of course, agrees to declare war, and the United States declares war on Spain in April of 1898. Included in that declaration of war was something called the Teller Amendment. So this is part of the United States' declaration of war against Spain. And in this Teller Amendment, this is where the United States emphasizes, or they try to emphasize, that this war is about helping Cuba become independent. It's not about taking over Cuba. They're trying to, again, send this message that this isn't about American imperialism. This isn't about the United States trying to take over people. And we're not interested in Cuba for that reason. We just want to help free them. The Teller Amendment was basically the United States promising that when the war was over, Cuba would be independent, that the United States wasn't going to take over Cuba, that the United States would, in fact, grant Cuba their independence and help them secure that independence from Spain. So again, trying to clarify the narrative there about what exactly they are fighting for. So the United States goes to war with Spain. The war is declared late April or early May 1898, and the fighting commences very, very quickly. Oddly enough, even though the United States has been tried to be very clear about saying this isn't about anything but Cuba, this is about helping them become independent and all that sort of stuff, oddly enough, the fighting doesn't begin in Cuba. So that's a little bit strange in that, we say this isn't about anything about taking overseas territories, yet the first place the United States attacks is somewhere way far away from Latin America. So we'll get to that in just a second. Now, one of the people who, unlike McKinley, would not have been conflicted and was not conflicted about whether or not to go to war was Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt, or as a lot of you probably know him. Many of you know that Teddy Roosevelt does go on to be president himself. At this point, he was the Secretary of the Navy. And as Secretary of the Navy, he was incredibly gung-ho about imperialism, about expansionism, and in this case, about going to war. And he sees this as necessary, and he sees this as an opportunity to acquire overseas territories and demonstrate power, and he is thrilled to death about it, just having the time of his life pretty much. And so Theodore Roosevelt, as Secretary of the Navy, he recommends that the United States immediately move to capture the Philippines, which is not in the Caribbean, that is in the Pacific. And that's what you see. This map here is showing you the main theater of the war. It's going to be in Cuba and a little bit in Puerto Rico. This is the Caribbean. You can see Florida here. And this little inset is the Pacific. So you can see there's China, and there's the Philippines right there. So that's in the Pacific. And Theodore Roosevelt believed this was the opportunity to take over the Philippines, which was another Spanish possession and more another local population that was trying to resist Spanish rule. And so that is why the first fighting of the war takes place in the Philippines. And he's Secretary of the Navy, so he dispatches the American fleet to the Philippines to launch an invasion of the Philippines, to first attack the Spanish fleet there in Manila Bay, which is right there in the Philippines, and then prepare for an invasion of the Philippines. Commodore George Dewey is the American Commodore, which means commanding a fleet of ships in the United States Navy. He is in command of that fleet that is going to sail into Manila Harbor to defeat a very tiny and very outdated Spanish fleet, which he does very, very quickly. So Commodore Dewey very quickly and easily opens fire on the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, which is absolutely no match for the United States fleet at that time. In fact, they're able to take over the harbor, defeat the Spanish fleet without loss of a single American life. Now, they do that before they were ready for any kind of ground invasion, so it takes several more months for that to get underway, and so it's longer and more difficult to take over the Philippines itself, but the United States does succeed in doing that by the end of the war, with help not just from themselves, not just the United States Army, but with help from Filipinos that were in an active state of rebellion against Spain anyway. And so they saw the United States at the moment as help, and they were welcomed at that point to help them defeat Spain. So that's part of the fighting going on there in the Philippines. Again, the initial attack goes very quickly, and then a ground invasion comes later. Now, this also is one of the reasons why we kind of mentioned this in the previous section. We talked about the initial interest in Hawaii and how the United States had tried to acquire this or tried to annex it a few years before this. But it is during the Spanish-American War that the United States takes the opportunity to officially annex Hawaii. Part of the reason why that was done and people saw that as more necessary was because you have this fight in the Philippines going on. And so the Hawaiian Islands would be a place to supply American warships and to gather equipment and all those sorts of things, and to further, just sort of beef up the American presence there in the Pacific so that they could fight in the Philippines and take the Philippines and all that sort of stuff. So that is part of the war. They don't really fight for that. That is just because that pretty much the United States, as I said, really already controlled it, but this is where Congress officially annexes Hawaii, and it becomes an official United States territory. So we have this stuff going on in the Philippines. Now let's take a look at what was happening in Cuba. And let me go ahead and explain this. I realize I didn't mention this. A splendid little war. Those were the words of the Secretary of State, John Hay. That is what he referred to the Spanish-American War as, a splendid little war, which emphasizes the quickness of this and the sort of decisiveness of the American victory here. Now, again, the United States claimed that this was all about Cuba, invading Cuba, and or not acquiring it, but helping them become independent, throwing off Spanish rule and all of that. The invasion of Cuba, though, doesn't even happen until a while into the war. It takes a while for, and granted, the whole thing's only about 3-4 months long, but takes them a while to kind of get things organized and prepare this invasion of Cuba. It was rather confused and kind of botched at first, but the United States does eventually kind of get it together, although they were quite unprepared and disorganized at first. For example, the Army troops that were dispatched, the supplies that they sent them were all like winter uniforms, wool and everything. And this is in the tropics, basically in the summertime. And there were diseases, and this is, malaria infested areas and stuff like that. Way more Americans die of those diseases in this war than die in combat. So they're finally able to get things together with the invasion of Cuba, and the whole time knowing, and Spain knowing quite well also, that they were no match for the United States. They weren't going to win a war with the United States, but Spain kind of was going on the mindset they would rather fight a war and lose it than just give up without fighting, that they kind of wanted the honor of fighting a war. In the invasion of Cuba, when they finally do sort of get things together, a group of soldiers that are not only instrumental in the fight in Cuba, that participate and succeed in a lot of important military campaigns in Cuba, but also become kind of an iconic figure, I guess you could say, an iconic symbol of the Spanish-American War, is a group of volunteer fighters called the Rough Riders. And that name, was well earned. This was not your formal, trained, really typical kind of army regiment. They were, and they were started by, and they were led by this guy right here. This is Teddy Roosevelt right there, who was, as we just saw, as we just mentioned, he was the Secretary of the Navy. He resigned as Secretary of the Navy during the war so that he could go fight. He was, like I said, he loved to get in a fight, and he was just as thrilled as he could be, having the time of his life during all of this. And he recruits and leads these Rough Riders, and they were literally rough around the edges. They were they intentionally recruited cowboys and ex-cons and rugby players, and this is when football was just kind of getting off the ground, like really rough and tough, even kind of criminal sort of background sort of people, to assist the Cuban rebels in finishing defeating the Spanish and getting them to remove themselves from Cuba, which they ultimately do. So the fighting is going on in the Philippines while also going on in Cuba. The Navy, even though the Rough Riders do a lot of very, very important things and a lot of, big heroic iconic charges, the famous charge up San Juan Hill and those kind of things to defeat the Spanish. The Navy also pretty much destroys the Spanish fleet around Cuba and surrounds them so they can't escape, ultimately leading to Spain realizing they can no longer fight, and an armistice is signed in August of 1898, which of course means they are no longer fighting. When the United States realizes that Spain is about to give up, they take the opportunity to also invade Puerto Rico to try to do the same thing there that they were trying to do in Cuba, to assist Puerto Ricans in throwing off Spanish rule, which they ultimately do. And again, the fighting has happened in the Philippines as well. And they succeed in defeating the Spanish in the Philippines a few days after this armistice is actually signed, which is going to have an effect on the peace agreement. So that pretty much ends this splendid little war, as some Americans would refer to it. Now let's look at the overall result and the sort of spoils of war that the United States gains as a result of this conflict. Well, this eventually we get a treaty that we call it's a Treaty of Paris because it was signed in Paris. Here's another Treaty of Paris. And of course, it ends the war, ends the fighting and all of that. But as far as what the United States gains and what's agreed to here, first of all, Spain agrees to recognize Cuban independence. So Cuba does obtain their independence, which again, the United States would have argued was the number one reason why this war was being fought and why the United States was involved in it, was to help Cuba gain its independence. So they do recognize that. In addition, the United States is going to gain 2 new territories from Spain, and that's Guam, which was in the Pacific, and Puerto Rico. So those are, here's Guam right there. You can see it in the Pacific right there. This is the Philippines. So kind of in between the Philippines and Hawaii. That's oversimplifying it, but you see what I mean. And then Puerto Rico, which again is here to the east of Cuba. So the United States gains those territories. Both of those, you may recognize, are still territories of the United States even today. Then there's this question of the Philippines, because the United States, as we just mentioned, did help the Philippines secure their independence from Spain, or to defeat the Spanish there. Now there, the situation was a little bit more complicated than with Cuba, because Spain argued that because they were not defeated until after the armistice had been signed, it didn't count. It's kind of like, scoring a touchdown after the clock's run out. So they argued that the Philippines should not be included, that it was still theirs, and they should still be able to retain it. That was resolved by the United States pays for it. So the United States paid, I think, about $20 million for the Philippines. So this is what the United States is left with, gains as a result of the war. Cuba is independent, but the United States still has a hand in it, and is kind of managing it for the time being. Guam and Puerto Rico are part of the United States territories, as is the Philippines. So Spain is lost pretty much all, this may even be all of their overseas territories as a result, and the United States has gained for the first time a true overseas empire. And so now there are big questions about what do we do with it, and where do you go from here, and how does the United States conduct itself as an imperial power? So let's take a look at some of those questions about this new empire, because of course there are some people, those pro-imperialists, your Teddy Roosevelts and those kind of folks, that are super excited, that saw this as inevitable. This is absolutely what the United States needed to do, is entitled to do. We're going to come in now and improve these countries and bring democracy and bring Christianity and make lots of money while we're at it, and bring factories and schools and all those kinds of things. But then there are also plenty of people that are just kind of dumbfounded as to how the United States could even consider such a policy, and how the United States could even consider ruling over other people, given the United States' background and the United States' professed belief system and all these sorts of things. So let's take a look at some of these lingering questions. One of the big conflicts, even amongst some of those people that might have supported imperialism overall, there is a big conflict over what do we do with the Philippines, because a lot of people did not expect, for one thing, to end up, having territories in the Caribbean is one thing. Having territory in the Pacific, off the coast of China and parts of Asia, that was something completely different and something unexpected. How would the United States manage that? But it's really not just that; it's the moral question of how can the United States, that were former colonies themselves, that have built a government, that have built a whole belief system based on this concept of consent of the governed and self-government and democracy, and that people have a right to rule themselves, and anti-monarchy and all this kind of stuff. How could the United States possibly rule over other people that way, and people who clearly wanted independence? The Filipinos that fought with Americans during the Spanish-American War, they saw the United States as help, and they welcomed them as a means of getting rid of the Spanish. But what they ultimately wanted was independence. And so some people were very, very adamant that this completely betrayed American values, that this was completely immoral, that the United States was just totally selling out by hanging on to the Philippines. But then there were also those that said, okay, well, maybe that might be true, but we can't just let the Philippines be independent either, because if it's independent, they're not ready for independence. There will be anarchy. It will become disorganized. And then other countries like Germany or some others might get it, and that would threaten us. It's sort of like a lesser of two evils kind of thing. And so the United States, for the time being, is trying to hang on to the Philippines with this big debate over whether or not this was the right thing or the wrong thing to do. And that upsets many people, including Filipinos themselves. This leads to a rebellion amongst Filipinos led by the same person. His name is Emilio Aguinaldo. He was leading the Filipino rebellion against Spain, saw the United States as an ally in that. But when the United States does not turn around and immediately grant the Philippines their independence, as they felt they were kind of unofficially promised, he leads rebellion then against the United States. So for the next 4 years, until about, I want to say about 1902, there's a rebellion the United States is fighting against in the Philippines, as people in the Philippines simply wanted independence. And it took the United States years to try to get that under control. And again, that was just a big moral debate for the United States as to whether or not ruling over other people was the right thing to do, or if they were completely selling their soul in doing that. And those ideas become, again, part of the national conversation. There's an entire organization that is created called the Anti-Imperialist League. It's led by William Jennings Bryan, whom you might remember from the whole populist thing. And this was a whole organization that was just opposed to expansionism, opposed to imperialism. And they argued, like some of those things we were just saying a moment ago, that this was downright immoral, that this betrayed the United States's belief system about consent of the governed, that it went against everything America stood for, that this was the United States selling out. They argued that imperialism was an economic drain, that this was an economic burden, not economic help, the way that a lot of pro-imperialists argued. They said this is going to cause a strain on our economy as we have to pay for and invest lots of money in the upkeep and the military presence and all the different things needed to maintain this empire. And they say, the United States has got enough problems. We have domestic problems at home. We've got labor disputes. We've got other kinds of things we need to be concentrating on. And this is a distraction from all of that. And this is actually going to lead to weakness rather than make us stronger. Anti-imperialists also would have argued that this is just going to drag us into other conflicts. This is going to drag us into conflicts that we don't belong in, particularly with the Philippines. That drags us into the business of Asia, of all kinds of countries this is just going to be conflict after conflict, war after war that we have no business in. So we should not be involved in this sort of thing because we need to worry about ourselves. And we know, of course, the argument of the imperialists. This also brought up a very deep question, philosophical and legal question, about just because these places are American territories, does that mean that the people there are entitled to the same rights as Americans? And that leads to a series of cases, actually a particular Supreme Court case. We call these the insular cases. And the ultimate question that the Supreme Court was looking at in these insular cases is the quote is often used, does the Constitution follow the flag? Meaning, when the United States flag is stuck in the ground and we say this is our territory, do the principles of the Constitution, specifically the Bill of Rights, does that apply there? Do those people in the Philippines, do those people in Puerto Rico, do those people in Guam, what is their status? What are they? Are they American citizens? And if they're not, do they have the same rights and privileges as American citizens, seeing as how this is American territory? And there were plenty of people